The map marked Dry Mesa as abandoned sometime in the early 70s. That was enough to convince me to drive 3 hours off the interstate with my camera and a backpack full of batteries. I made money photographing forgotten places across the American Southwest, and ghost towns always attracted viewers. Empty buildings had a way of making people imagine their own stories. The dirt road leading into town looked untouched for years. Desert shrubs had begun swallowing it whole, and a faded wooden sign leaned sideways, barely readable beneath layers of sun damage. Welcome to Dry Mesa. Population, 0. Perfect. The silence surprised me first. Desert silence usually carried wind or insects. Here, nothing moved. Even my footsteps sounded strange, as if they belonged to someone walking a few feet behind me. I told myself it was just the echo from the old storefronts. Most of the buildings had collapsed roofs and shattered windows. I spent an hour taking photos, careful not to enter anything unstable. Everything looked exactly as an abandoned mining town should, except one house. It wasn't restored, but it looked maintained. The porch had been swept recently. No footprints, no tire tracks, just clean wood. I knocked anyway. No answer. The front door creaked open by itself. I stayed outside. Hello? Nothing. After another minute, curiosity beat common sense. Inside, dust covered everything except one wooden chair facing the front window. The seat looked polished from years of use. Someone had been sitting there. Recently. I photographed the room before leaving. When I checked the image on my camera screen, the chair wasn't empty. A man sat there wearing a faded denim jacket. His face was turned toward the window. I looked back into the room. The chair was empty. I checked the photo again. Still there. I blamed the camera. Heat sometimes caused strange digital artifacts. The explanation sounded weak even in my own head. I hurried outside. Across the street stood the old general store. I raised the camera. Through the viewfinder, someone watched me from inside. Lower camera. Empty building. Raise camera. Person. Lower camera. Empty again. I laughed nervously. Okay, that's enough. The desert plays tricks on people. Everyone knows that. Still, I packed my gear. As I walked toward my truck, I kept feeling watched. Not threatened, observed. Like someone waiting for me to notice them. The truck started immediately. Relief washed over me. Until I reached the end of town. The same welcome sign stood ahead. Welcome to Dry Mesa. Population, 0. I frowned. I should have been miles past it. Maybe I'd taken the wrong road. I turned around. 10 minutes later, the sign again. Same cracks, same leaning post, same faded lettering. My GPS displayed a blank screen. No roads, no signal. Only a tiny blinking arrow that spun endlessly. I drove slower. Every building looked familiar now. Not because I'd photographed them, because nothing had changed. The shadows stayed in exactly the same place despite the passing time. Then I noticed the chair again. The house stood with its front door open. This time the chair wasn't empty. Neither was the porch. An elderly man stood outside, hands folded behind his back. He wasn't transparent. He wasn't frightening. He looked tired. He smiled politely and tipped an imaginary hat. I blinked. The porch was empty. That night, I somehow found the highway again, without remembering the drive. Weeks later, I developed the photographs. Every picture contained people. Miners, children, shopkeepers, families, always looking directly at me. Except one. The man in the chair never looked at the camera. He was watching the road leading out of town, as though he'd spent decades waiting for someone to prove that leaving Dry Mesa had never really been possible. I've never believed abandoned places were haunted. Dangerous? Absolutely. Unstable buildings, abandoned mine shafts, rattlesnakes, those were real threats. Ghosts were just stories people invented to explain uncomfortable feelings. That's what I told myself when I accepted a freelance assignment to photograph forgotten desert towns across Nevada. The last stop on my list was Coyote Wells. It had once been a railroad settlement before the tracks were rerouted decades earlier. Everyone left, leaving behind faded storefronts, a weather-beaten church, and a rusted water tower that still dominated the skyline. Locals at the gas station 20 miles away warned me not to stay after sunset. Not because of ghosts, because according to them, people start hearing things. I assumed they meant wind. By late afternoon, I'd already photographed most of the town. The light was perfect. casting long orange shadows across empty streets. The silence felt peaceful more than unsettling, until I heard my name, soft, almost conversational. Eric. I turned immediately. Nobody. The sound hadn't echoed. It had been close enough that I instinctively expected someone standing beside me. I laughed at myself. Hours alone in the desert could make anyone jumpy. I continued shooting. 10 minutes later, I heard it again. Eric. Exactly the same voice. Calm, patient, neither male nor female. I spun around. Nothing moved except a torn curtain fluttering inside an abandoned hotel. The rational part of my brain assembled explanations. Stress, fatigue, wind passing through broken buildings. I drank some water and kept working. The third time, the voice came from above. I looked toward the water tower. No one stood on the platform. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had just stepped back out of sight. Curiosity got the better of me. The ladder was old, but solid enough to climb carefully. From the top, the entire town stretched beneath me like a forgotten photograph. Beautiful, empty, quiet. Then I noticed movement. Someone walked down Main Street, a man wearing a tan jacket. He moved slowly, stopping outside each building before continuing toward the edge of town. I raised my camera. The street was empty through the lens. I lowered it. The man returned. Raise. Gone. Lower. Walking again. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. Instead of climbing down immediately, I watched him. He never looked at me. He simply followed the same route over and over, disappearing behind the old train depot before reappearing at the opposite end of town, always repeating, like a film caught in an endless loop. Eventually the sun dropped behind the mountains. The temperature fell almost instantly. As I descended the ladder, I heard footsteps below. Someone was climbing toward me. Metal rungs clanged one after another. I froze. Hello? The climbing stopped. Silence. I looked down. No one. Only the ladder stretching to the ground. I hurried the rest of the way. By the time my boots touched the dirt, I was breathing harder than the climb should have caused. I packed my equipment and headed for my SUV. Before opening the driver's door, I glanced back. The water tower stood against the darkening sky. Someone stood on top, watching, too far away to identify. I blinked. The platform was empty. I drove away without looking back again. A week later, while organizing my photographs, I noticed something strange. Every image from Coyote Wells included the water tower somewhere in the background. Every single one, even the close-ups, even shots taken inside buildings, and in every photograph, someone stood on the platform. The figure was always too distant to recognize, until the final image. It wasn't facing the town anymore. It was facing the camera, wearing my tan jacket. I checked the timestamp. The photo had been taken nearly an hour before I arrived in Coyote Wells. I deleted it immediately. The next morning, it was back in the folder, exactly where I'd found it. Sometimes I wonder whether I ever climbed that tower at all, or whether someone else remembered me doing it long before I got there. I wasn't chasing ghosts, I was chasing quiet. After my divorce, my therapist suggested I spend a few weeks away from cities, phones, and deadlines. I rented a 4-wheel drive SUV, packed enough supplies for a week, and started driving across Arizona with no real destination. I found Ash Hollow by accident. Town wasn't marked on my GPS. I noticed an old highway sign pointing toward it, and figured it might be worth exploring before finding a campsite. There wasn't much left. A schoolhouse with broken windows, a boarded-up post office, a row of weathered homes slowly disappearing into the desert. The place looked frozen in time. Near the center of town stood a small motel. Its faded sign read, "Vacancy." I laughed. There couldn't possibly be anyone running it. Still, curiosity won. Inside the office, the furniture was covered in dust except for the reception counter. It looked clean. A brass bell sat beside an old guest register. Without thinking, I tapped it. The sound echoed through the empty building. No one came. I should have left. Instead, I noticed a key hanging behind the desk. Room 6. I convinced myself it had probably been left there decades ago. One night, in an abandoned motel, sounded like the kind of story I'd laugh about later. The room was surprisingly intact. Old furniture, faded wallpaper, a working bed frame with a clean-looking mattress that seemed oddly untouched by time. No electricity, no running water. But it felt lived in. I ate dinner from a camping stove outside before locking myself inside the room. The desert became completely silent after sunset, not peaceful, expectant. Around midnight, I woke to soft knocking, 3 slow taps. I checked my watch, 12:17. Hello? Nothing. I opened the door. The parking lot was empty beneath the moonlight. No footprints, no animals, only wind pushing sand across cracked pavement. I went back to bed. 12 minutes later, 3 knocks again. This time I ignored them. Another 12 minutes, 3 knocks. Exactly the same rhythm, exactly the same volume. By 3 in the morning, I wasn't sleeping anymore. I sat in the dark staring at the door. 12 minutes, knock. 12 minutes, knock. Every time. Just before sunrise, the knocking stopped. I stepped outside. The parking lot contained tire tracks, fresh ones. They circled the motel all night, but they never led onto the highway, only around the building. Again and again, as though someone had been driving in circles until dawn. I decided to leave immediately. While loading my SUV, I noticed something lying beneath the windshield wiper. A motel receipt. Room 6. Guest name. My name. Check-in date. Tomorrow. I laughed nervously. Someone had to be playing a prank. Except the paper wasn't new. It had yellowed with age. Ink had faded naturally. The date printed at the bottom was from 1984. Impossible. I tossed it into the passenger seat and drove away. 100 miles later, I stopped for gas. The receipt was gone. That evening, I searched online for Ash Hollow. Eventually, I found a newspaper archive. The motel had closed in 1984 after the owner disappeared. The article mentioned something else. Travelers passing through often claimed they heard knocking on motel doors during the night. Investigators believed lonely drivers had encouraged one another's stories until they became local folklore. No evidence was ever found. I almost felt relieved reading that, until I noticed a photograph attached to the article. The motel parking lot, taken the week it closed. 6 cars were parked outside. One of them was my SUV. Same scratches, same roof rack, same license plate. The picture had been published 38 years before I bought the vehicle. I enlarged the image until it became blurry. Someone stood outside room 6. The resolution wasn't clear enough to show a face, but I recognized the way he stood. One hand in his pocket, weight resting on his left foot. Exactly the posture I catch myself in whenever I'm waiting for someone to answer a door. I still wake up some nights expecting those 3 knocks, not because I think something is outside, because I'm afraid one night I'll open the door and finally meet the guest who checked into room 6 before I ever arrived. The first panic attack I ever had happened on a crowded subway in Chicago. The second happened in the middle of the Mojave Desert. I took the trip because everyone kept telling me I needed a fresh start after burning out at work. I wasn't looking for adventure. I just wanted to drive for a week without answering emails or hearing my phone buzz. By my 4th day, I'd wandered onto an old state highway that barely appeared on my map. That's where I found Black Ridge. A weather-beaten sign announced the town with peeling white paint. Beyond it sat a handful of abandoned buildings, a crumbling courthouse, and a gas station whose pumps had probably stopped working decades ago. What caught my attention wasn't the town, it was the green highway exit sign standing at the far end of the main street. Exit, 2 miles. It looked strangely new compared to everything else. Fresh reflective paint, no rust. I assumed the highway department had simply forgotten to remove it. I parked beside the old courthouse and spent the afternoon exploring. Black Ridge wasn't remarkable. It looked like dozens of other ghost towns I'd visited. Still, something felt subtly wrong. Every street seemed longer than it should have been. Every walk between buildings took more time than I expected. I blamed the heat. By sunset, I decided to leave. I drove toward the exit sign. 2 miles passed. No highway. Instead, another faded building appeared. Then the courthouse. Then the gas station. I had somehow driven back into town without turning around. I frowned and checked the GPS. No signal. The map showed my vehicle sitting in the middle of empty desert. I tried again. Same result. I stopped beside the exit sign. Maybe I'd taken the wrong road. The sign still read, exit, 2 miles. I reset the trip odometer. Exactly 2 miles later, the same sign. Not another one. The same dent on the support post. The same bullet hole near the bottom. A cold pressure settled in my chest. I told myself I was exhausted. People became disoriented in unfamiliar places all the time. I parked and waited for darkness to pass. Morning would make everything obvious. That night I slept inside the SUV with the doors locked. At some point after midnight, I woke to the sound of an engine idling nearby. Not loud, just close enough that I knew another vehicle had entered town. Relieved, I climbed out. Hello? The engine shut off. Silence. I walked toward the sound. Nothing. No headlights, no tire tracks, only empty streets glowing beneath the moon. The next morning I tried leaving on foot. If the road somehow looped, I'd eventually notice. I counted every step. At exactly 4,000 steps I reached the exit sign. 2 more miles. The courthouse. Again. The panic attack hit without warning. My breathing became shallow. My hands shook so badly I dropped my water bottle. I sat on the curb repeating the only thought that made sense. This isn't possible. An hour later, after I'd calmed down, I noticed something carved into the concrete beside me. Small letters, easy to miss. Don't follow the sign. I looked up. The exit sign stood exactly where it always had. For the first time, I ignored it. Instead of driving toward it, I turned down a narrow dirt road behind the courthouse that looked like it led nowhere. It wasn't on my map. It wasn't even wide enough to qualify as a road. After 15 minutes, the pavement finally appeared ahead. A state highway. Real traffic. Real people. I never stopped driving until I reached the next town. Months later, I mentioned Black Ridge to an elderly historian during a museum tour. He stared at me for several seconds before asking one question. Did you leave by the exit sign? I told him no. He nodded slowly. My father visited Black Ridge in 1968, he said. He came home convinced the town wanted people to leave the wrong way. I asked what he meant. He only shrugged. He said every ghost town has a memory. Most just remember the people who lived there. He paused before adding quietly, but Black Ridge remembers the people who tried to escape. I never found Black Ridge again. I've searched maps, old mining records, and historical archives. Nothing matches the place I visited. Sometimes I wonder if that's because it never existed. Other times, when I'm driving alone on unfamiliar highways, I catch sight of a green exit sign in the distance. For a split second, I expect it to read exactly what I saw that afternoon. Exit, 2 miles. Whenever that happens, I keep driving, no matter how badly I need to stop. Some roads don't lead you out. They only convince you that you're getting closer.